Good morning, everyone, from Glasgow. This will be an exciting session for us. We are doing a side event on the topic Closing the Climate Protection Gap, Lessons Learned from Different Levels of Governance. And this is really a hybrid side event. So we are physically here in Glasgow, where this is an active dialogue and discussion. But we also have you virtually dialed in. And let's see how this works. Usually side events are very dynamic during the negotiations. So you try to get, for example, government representatives, but of course there are sideline negotiations going on. So we have that element. And at the same time, with the virtual participation, there are often kind of technical challenges. So we will see how this all comes together. I'm Sönke Kreft. I'm the Executive Director of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. I'm also Head of Unit at United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. And I warmly welcome on behalf of the organizers of this side event. And so this is a merged side event between the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, between the Munich Re Foundation, as well as MCII, the organization that I'm representing. I also know usually these side events, there are kind of merged concepts all over the place. Of course, this is not what we want to do today. What we actually have is, I think also because we have like partnerships with and relationships with all these partners and also engagements that we can actually have a very focused discussion, a presentation and discussion, and we will be able to distill some lessons learned, but also like general guidance when it comes to the topic of financial protection and also what it means in terms of engagement at different levels. For example, also the international level, which is, as I said, one topic of active dialogue and discussions. Before I introduce our panelists, let me do a very quick introduction into the theme. So it's quite clear the climate crisis is here and now. The IPCC report just came out a few weeks ago. It's also quite obvious that the year 2021, with all its ramification of the COVID pandemic globally, but if you actually look at weather-related catastrophes and disasters, this will be one of the most costly years overall. And also if you look at the number of affected people, with some likelihood this will be one of the years with the most affected people worldwide. And I mean, this really shows that this is not a topic of the distant future, but it's really a crisis moment and also a rallying point. And I think this also provides the right background for the COP26 here in Glasgow. Everyone is affected, developed and developing countries alike. But at the same time, I think, and this is important also to get these voices heard in Glasgow, there's a huge disparity when it comes to climate impacts, and we will listen to Pacific Island voices today, which are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I think it's important that we have this notion also present here at the discussions today. Climate impacts actually will lead to a protection, or are leading to a protection gap. There is already a protection gap today, and this will require action from different stakeholders. It will definitely need ramped up public protection approaches, like, for example, social protection, but it will also need new and innovative forms of individual and private protection, for example, climate risk insurance. And today's event is about looking into these options and also see how they can play together in a kind of comprehensive strategy. It is also quite clear that it will require action on all levels. Impacts often are site-specific and local, which means localized solutions need to be there. There's a big role of the governments to protect their citizens. That's also quite clear, to provide the right incentives and regulations for individual insurance, for example, to be possible. But quite clearly, there's also a role for the regional level. We have regional institutions here today. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, also for the international level, to help these communities at the front lines of climate change. And for me, this is also really one of the discussions here at the COP. It's a topic called loss and damage, and quite a few aspects we are talking today, like social protection, but also climate and disaster as finance, to provide a strategic approach to these for this protection, a strategic financing approach for this protection. They are also under active considerations in the talks under the theme of loss and damage finance. And then maybe lastly, the aspiration, as I said in the beginning, is also to have a few sound bites and presentations, but really follow up with an active discussion. You have the chance from the outside to ask us questions. I prepared some questions for the panelists, and then we will aim to summarize some take forward message, and also some general aspiration when it comes to policy guidance. Okay, I hope this is all clear, and with that I would actually start with our first presenter, Mr. Carlos Lee Morrissey from the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. He will provide regional perspectives and also like some perspectives on a recently launched working group on disaster risk financing instruments in the Pacific, and generally what it means for the region. And I think he also has some like broader perspectives to share and messages to share from the region towards COP26. So Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me acknowledge MCII, UNCDF, all the partners for the opportunity, and especially not so much the opportunity for myself, but the opportunity for the Pacific voices to be heard. So let me start by taking us right back into what I call a historical continuum of financial risk management and risk-averse products, and also risk protection for Pacific people. So at the start of the financial protection in the Pacific, it really was very reactive and only responding to post-event occurrences. That proved to be quite costly. Sometimes the assistance will not reach those most in need until a few days later, sometimes weeks, sometimes even months. So from their perspective, obviously it was inefficient and also very costly and ad hoc and uncertain. So from that starting point, the regional organizations, for example, the organization I represent, the Pacific Island Forum, decided to take a more active role and be a coordinating mechanism, bringing together partners, developing policies for national governments to be able to take on board, and also providing technical and capacity training and development. So as time progressed, the financial protection modalities adjusted to be more responsive, starting with in-country modalities, national disaster and climate risk funds. But note that it's still reactionary. So while these were welcomed from a small island nation perspective, like most of us in the Pacific, it didn't quite fill the gap, so to speak. And it's the topic of our discussions today about closing the climate risk protection gap. So we had to be, in your introduction, talk about being innovative, bringing new modalities. And I think in your introduction, you also mentioned that I'm part of the coordinating group of a working group on disaster risk financing. This is really under the umbrella of a wider framework, what we call the FRDP, the Framework for Resilience Development in the Pacific. So you take the shift from responsive to more preparedness, and also now the risk resilience development. So the whole sphere or the continuum of policy development is really about being able, we know the science is there, the IPCC report speaks to that. So we know what we're dealing with. So now we put in place protection measures, And also around the planning, and you mentioned about the social protection as well. We can't just protect infrastructure. We can't just protect buildings in the subject. We have to ask the question, why are we doing this? It's really about protecting the people. So how do we actually reach the people? So from a regional perspective, when we started, when we have the multinational agencies come into the frame, it still is very high level at government level. So with the insurance as a new modality, if I can jump straight into the insurance perspective, I know you guys from MCII have a lot more to talk about it from the Pacific. It's really about assisting our national governments because they don't have the resources to start with, but they're suffering the cost. So how do we make it more efficient, more effective? And insurance is one modality that obviously has been proven in other spaces. So we established the Pacific Catastrophe Insurance Facility, and that provides parametric insurance. For those who are in this space, really understand that it's pre-triggered conditions. But then again, there's really very, very national level, very high level. So the developments over time has now gone into microinsurance, which I think MCII and UNCDF played quite a big part in developing the product for the Pacific. So now this is being offered through community-based cooperatives and collectives. And the idea is actually to be able to reach the most effective, the community people, the people in the front line of climate change. When something happens, if a cyclone hits and you lose your crop, maybe even lose part of your building, sometimes full residential buildings collapse, you want help immediately. You don't want to wait 2 or 3 weeks before help arrives. But this financial protections offers that mechanism. Going a bit further, we also have to develop the capacity of our financial institutions to be able to offer these products, and also the national systems to be able to receive them. It's not just about setting up the insurance and then you get the payouts, but the way it moves through the system itself has to be efficient, and it has to reach the people in time, and it has to be also future-looking. And that's where the part of the discussion goes towards resilience development. I'll stop there for now and really want to add some more about the social protection and the loss and damage discussions that you mentioned in your introduction. But I'd like to give the opportunity to other speakers to get into the conversation. Thank you, Sven.
Thank you, Neil, for these perspectives. And I will now, well, actually, I have to apologize our Fiji government representatives. We just received the message briefly before the side event that one of the high-level panels is going overtime. So he was supposed to give national perspectives on some of the recent developments in Fiji and in the Pacific, also some of the developments you just heard from Lee. And so probably we can fast track and go to our next presenter. And I'm looking at you, Jennifer Phillips, who is a colleague and the responsible program officer from our side, leading on the Pacific engagement. I think you can also give some of the perspectives that we were hoping to get from Vineil Narayan, the government of Fiji representatives at the same time. So Jennifer, please.
Thank you, Sunka, for that introduction, and thank you to Lee for giving us that overview. The work of the Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program, which is the joint UN program between the UN Capital Development Fund, UNCDF, UNDP, and UNU-EHS, which is the UN University, where MCII is located, is really a direct result from some of the work that the Pacific Island Forum has taken on in pushing the need for the development of disaster risk financing instruments and climate risk insurance in the Pacific region. So thank you for providing that overview. And what I'd like to do is introduce a bit about what our program and what our aims are and what our general approach is, because I know often in discussions with partners, working on topics like insurance, it's not always clear why this should be a solution being developed for lower income countries where many people don't have a lot of wealth to spend on products like insurance. And basically what we want to do is explain that after certain types of climate risk events occur, such as tropical cyclones, like we've seen in the last couple of years in the Pacific region with Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016 in Fiji, and more recently Tropical Cyclone Harold in 2020, is that these cyclones have devastating effects on the countries, and particularly for certain groups and certain livelihoods. Those working in farming and agriculture can have all of their crops or most of their crops destroyed, as well as those working in the tourism sector might experience a very big loss in income from the lack of tourism that comes following these events. Also, fishermen can be highly affected in different types of MSMEs. And what's important to understand is when these events hit these countries, people then are already automatically in a worse off financial situation because you've just lost your livelihood, or your livelihood has been greatly reduced. And so what you have to do is find other ways to start supporting yourself. And this can often mean having to take on negative coping mechanisms. So for example, this might be having to take out very expensive credit from formal or very expensive informal lenders. This could mean having to sell off certain assets, your livestock or other material. This could mean having to reduce your consumption, take children out of school because of the school fees, postpone. And what you see as a result of these events is that they can easily push people down into poverty, and people can get stuck into a poverty trap because of these events. And so what we want to do is try to think about ways that we can better financially manage our risk with the help of different products like insurance. And as Lee was already explaining, the nice possibility with parametric insurance is that it works quite differently from traditional types. What you find often with countries in the global south is that it's only the richest 5–10% of society that has any type of insurance protection against different climate risk through property insurance, but for the majority of the population, these types of products are not available to them. And with parametric insurance, what we do is we allow anyone who lives in these countries to purchase this type of insurance so that when a tropical cyclone or a drought or another type of event hits, that they will quickly get a payout within a 2-week period. And with this payout, then the hope is that people will no longer have to take on so many negative coping strategies, and that they can use this money to get back on their feet and to start repairing and recovering after these different events. And with the Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program, we work closely with different stakeholders in the region, including PIFS and also including the country governments. And this is why we were hoping the government of Fiji would be able to be here to speak a bit more about this, because it's due to their efforts and support in these types of programs that we're able to develop so quickly the different disaster risk financing products and to get those into the market. And basically with our program, we understand that just developing different types of insurance products or credit products would not be sufficient. We also want to work together with the governments to increase their understanding of different disaster risk financing instruments that are available to them, so that they can also consider which way they want to best prepare themselves and create a disaster risk financing strategy that takes into consideration a risk layering approach and knowing which types of products would be most appropriate for different types of events. We also aim very heavily to work on increasing financial literacy and education on these topics. One way that these products can go south very quickly in countries is if people don't understand how they work and how they're supposed to pay out. And it's very important because they are so new in the markets that people understand exactly what their role is and how they can best be used depending on their situation. Of course, insurance isn't the appropriate instrument for everyone, and so it's very important that each individual and family and community understands what their risk profile is and how they're affected by different events, so that they can then make an educated decision on which products they would want to take up. And lastly, what our program also focuses on is how new technologies and digitalization can be used then to increase access to these products, as well as reduce the overall cost and increase the expediency in which payouts are made to individuals. Unfortunately, in the Pacific region, access to mobile phones and internet has been greatly increasing in recent years, and this allows then for an easier and cheaper distribution of products, as well as for the overall payouts. And with that, I'll pass back to our moderator. Hopefully later on in this session, we can discuss more about different aspects of the program.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for these perspectives, adding on what Lee said before. So I now want to actually go to another theme and also world region. So we now heard about regional perspectives. We also heard about kind of market-based instrument that can help lowering the protection gap of climate risks. And I now want to come to the national level. I'm joined here today also by a UNU-EHS colleague, Dr. Simone Sandholz, and she will give us some perspectives around active, adaptive social protection strategies, and also some recent engagement together with the government of Indonesia, the Ministry of Planning, and also the German International Development Corporation. Simone, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sönke, and yeah, thanks for inviting me and giving me the possibility to speak about our activities in the context of adaptive social protection. And let me start by quoting Lee, because I found it so impressive when you said the science is there. So we know that there are significant adaptation gaps and that we need to not only prepare for climate change, but also learn and improve how to cope with it and how to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we know we still have protection gaps, and that also that they are potentially even growing, and particularly in the context of those countries which are already hit hard by natural hazards, which are likely to be exacerbated, like hurricanes we've heard of, or flooding. So, and this is on top of many people who anyway might face hunger, poverty, or other livelihood shocks, which again might be exacerbated or newly induced by climate change. So there is a strong need for a more integrated approach, which could be adaptive social protection. And that's, as Sönke has mentioned, and something that UNU-EHS, together with MCII and others, are supporting GIZ in to facilitate the government of Indonesia to develop an overarching strategy of adaptive social protection by means of a roadmap. And impressively, the government of Indonesia has already put this endeavor in its midterm development plan, and it's really a very impressive initiative which is bringing together different ministries and actors. But how is it actually being done? So maybe let's step one step back and say it involves the inclusion and the collaboration of various different actors in a quite novel governance scheme. So it needs to bundle anyway limited resources to close those protection gaps. And well, particularly it is linking the benefits of three sectors. First of all, obviously social protection, meaning that existing social protection programs like food support, like food baskets, for instance, that could deliver very fast and efficient support to those who need it most, are part of this joint endeavor. Secondly, we also have disaster risk management, which could provide additional technical support, for instance, by means of early warning systems to give the adequate information about when a disaster might hit. And lastly, also climate change adaptation by providing proactive tools, for instance, climate projections, so that we do not only know which disasters might be coming in the next days, but also know what it would be like in the next decades to come, so that the governments could prepare adequately. And that's exactly what the government of Indonesia is now trying to do in its roadmap. So this is about integrating the relevant policies, strategies, and then other programs and mechanisms to strengthen people's resilience, and then to particularly climate change-induced hazards. So it's really about the overlap of those three sectors, so social protection, climate adaptation, and disaster risk management. And in the long run, this should not only support people before, but also not only after, but also before a disaster by supporting them. Just as an example, for instance, we've already heard a lot about insurances. Unemployment insurances might be tweaked, might be adapted for other circumstances so that the same type of mechanism, the same insurance might also support people not only when they get or when they lose their job, but also when they might not go to their work for a couple of days or weeks or even months after a disaster has hit because their facilities are destroyed. And this might be particularly relevant for small, medium enterprises or people who run their own little business and don't have much of a savings. So such mechanisms could support people and can be part of that adaptive social protection. And it can be made actionable really by this sectoral integration. So in the context of Indonesia, it is different ministries coming together, developing those mechanisms and putting it together under 4 building blocks, which are government leadership, programs and delivery systems, then data and information, because data is very fundamental for doing it. And last but not least, obviously, also the adequate finance needs to be there. I think I'd leave it there for now and happy to discuss it further.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Simone, for this input. And now I would come to the last contribution before we actually start a Q&A session and also a joint dialogue and discussion. And I'm coming to you, Aparna. Aparna Srivastava. Actually, you are a resilience ambassador, right? That's how we call you. So basically, at UNU-EHS, together with partners from the UNFCCC Secretariat and the Munich Re Foundation, there's a long-time engagement to bring together practitioners as well as scientists in an academy, a summer academy. And the last academy, or the academy of 2020, focused on the topic of social protection, resilience, and climate change. Outputs of these academy include, for example, scientific journal articles, joint contributions, but also concrete policy asks and policy contributions. And I'm therefore asking you, Aparna, to give us a little bit of insights of dialogues and discussions that happened at the Summer Academy, but maybe you're also able to bring in some of the perspectives of your current engagement with the US government. Aparna, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thank you, Sonka, and thank you for just all the organizers for this wonderful, important discussion. As Sonka mentioned, I'm wearing 2 hats today, and I'll start off with speaking to kind of the work of the Academy, because I really do think it's quite an essential one in terms of how it brings together folks from kind of the scientific world, UN delegates, private sector and civil society actors, and academia to focus on different topics every year and really bring together kind of forward the process of science-based decision making. So last year, the focus of the Academy was around social protection and really quite engaging discussions with regards to that. I think there were I'd identify 3 key areas that were really kind of identified as the takeaways for that discussion. One is just how integral disaster risk management is to social protection schemes more broadly, and that's something that we've heard even today, and really look at how we can, given that DRM is a part of these conversations, really looking at how we can look to synergize and not necessarily reinvent the wheel. And second, I think is a point that's also important to consider, and not one that's hard to imagine that weak social protection systems are often coupled with situations where adaptation finance and climate finance more broadly is lacking. Right, and so I think that the concerns around financing and financing gaps really goes hand in hand with gaps around social protection. So I think addressing these matters from kind of a justice lens is a critical one. And finally, also that has been covered today is the role of insurance, right? Insurance plays a crucial role for social protection schemes, but also for adaptation processes more broadly. So really looking to kind of expand and develop the work of the insurance markets and access to those that are most climate vulnerable, and especially in low-income countries is critical. So I'm proud to be sitting here with colleagues from MCII that are really pushing these critical topics forward, obviously in collaboration with UNU-EHS. So I'll speak a little bit, I'll switch hats and speak a little bit to my current role. So I currently serve in the US government as the Deputy Chief Climate Officer of the US International Development Finance Corporation. So it's the US government's development bank, and we've made some pretty bold commitments with regards to climate finance this year. Of course, we're looking at a net zero target that we've placed at 2040, one that we're quite excited about. But I think the other two commitments that we've made are even more relevant to this discussion. One is for a third of our transactions to be climate linked moving forward, starting basically next year in terms of how these are calculated. And that's really quite significant, looking at the broader portfolio of investments that we have, but also the resources that we have available. And so really looking at kind of broadening the definition. I think especially in the DFI world, climate finance is very much synonymous with renewable energy. And so looking at how we can broaden that to include whether it's food security and agriculture, insurance access, and other investments, that's something that we're quite keen on. We've also launched a climate action facility that's providing technical assistance specifically for developing climate-related investment opportunities. And so I think especially in an area like social protection, where we need more and more innovation and more reach into local level access and local level coverage of social protection schemes, I think technical assistance is something that's, I think, is helpful to develop some of that. And I think also just to flag, I don't work for USAID, but there are other arms within the U.S. government that have been working quite closely on the issues of social protection and humanitarian assistance. With DFC, for example, my agency recently financed the Intra-Resilience Investment Fund, one that's providing microinsurance to climate vulnerable communities. And so just kind of underscoring the interest and ambition to invest more in these types of solutions. Now, market-based solutions aren't going to be the answer to everything, of course. We know that in adaptation, we do need to think about more innovative strategies. But just kind of to wrap up there, that we do have some transactions, some track record as a DFI, and we're really looking to build upon that. So I'll pause there and turn it back to Sönke.
Thank you, Aparna. This is encouraging to hear. So I would actually want to transition to the next segment of the side event, which is a joint discussion. And I also prepared some questions, but really the appeal also to the outside world, outside of Glasgow, following us virtually. Please post questions to us. I will then also direct them to the relevant speaker on the panel. In the absence of questions from the outside so far, let me maybe start and come back to you, Lee. You are representing an organization with a regional mandate and also track record, of course. Could you maybe tell us a little bit what is important in terms of having regional cooperation when it comes to topic like closing the protection gap, but also especially the financing element, like risk financing strategies and risk transfer? Why do we have a regional lens?
Yes, thank you very much, Svenk, for the question. Let me start by saying that in the Pacific, of course, we welcome institutions, organizations that come in with assistance. But as a regional organization, we have to ensure that we match the organizations coming in with the needs of the Pacific, the needs of the countries. So as a regional organization, we provide, if you like, a coordinating mechanism. We talk to partners. We see what's suitable for our region. We understand, we deal with our national governments on a daily basis. We understand what the needs are. We understand what works, what does not work. We have been there. We need to get localized solutions. So we provide the conduit, if you like, to match the localized context with the regional organizations, the international organizations that come in, but also we provide feedback. And there's a dialogue that's ongoing, so we are able to adjust products so that they're fit for purpose. In saying that, I have to acknowledge, even though in the absence of Vanille, I can't speak from a national perspective, but we also deal with national countries and try to encourage them and give policy advice to see where they can adjust or provide an enabling environment. And I can give you the example in Fiji. I work closely with the PICAP project. In fact, I'm one of the board members on that particular project. That Fiji governments, through their reserve bank, were able to implement legislations to allow localized insurance companies to be able to offer these products. So obviously, there's a financial management and financial regulations framework. And that's where we provide policy advice, if you like. And we work closely with those institutions, those regional institutions, and also national institutions, to be able to allow these kind of products to reach people. And in saying that, I also thank these cooperative organizations, the collectives. I mentioned in Fiji, we have and I think Jennifer will probably know quite a bit about the Fiji Sugar Cane Growers Organization, which their members are hit with cyclones year after year. And the economic loss and productive loss, not just for the particular events, but the compounding loss, it needs to be addressed. And that's where, as a regional organization, I feel that we have a role in matching the products and the needs so that we're actually hitting the people that need the assistance most.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sweet. Thank you for that. And actually, I mean, by all means, I encourage also the presenters to ask questions to each other. So I guess that was kind of a common question directed to Jennifer, and I can add on it. So I mean, the PICAP program is in existence for about a year or so, and there was already quite a big progress made, especially in Fiji, and also I think the government of Fiji was very supportive and helpful. Could you maybe talk us through some of the milestones and what contributed to this early success in the project?
Thank you, Sanka, and thank you, Lee. So for a bit of context, basically the Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program kicked off last year in December 2020, and we have been active now for about 9 months and 10, 11 months now. And basically within this first year, what we have been able to do is to create and launch the first parametric insurance product, market-based, in Fiji, and currently have 430 farmers registered to receive this product. And I have to say this is only possible because of what Lee was explaining, because of the work that had already been done within the region, because of organizations like the Pacific Island Forum that have already been advising governments about the need for these different types of products, that it made it very easy then and possible to then come in to Fiji and to other countries to speak with the governments on the topics. And there was already this knowledge on what the ambition was and what the benefits are. And for that, I'd like to thank Lee and the Pacific Island Forum for really dedicating so much time to this topic and so much of their efforts and work in educating governments and advising them on these different topics. Also, one of the big contributing factors to getting a product in the market so quickly, which was, of course, very important to us because you do see these cyclones hitting more and more often in the region, was the direct support from the government of Fiji and especially the Ministry of Economy, and as well as the insurance regulators in Fiji. And it's because of their dedication to these topics that we're able to then introduce the products without too much time being spent working in bureaucracy. And what we even saw from the Ministry of Economy was that they took the decision to create a VAT, value-added tax exemption for the first parametric product in the market. And this really shows how the government of Fiji is prioritizing the need of individuals and families and groups to accessing these different types of products. Because of this VAT exemption, the products become more affordable and the benefits for these products become larger. And so due to this already regional understanding and this government understanding of the topics, we were able to accomplish so much in a short amount of time. And we look forward in the next couple of months of seeing how we can take this pilot product and then use it as an example to see how we want to develop other types of products for other groups. The first product protects against extreme rain and wind, and this is very valuable for sugarcane farmers in Fiji, as well as some other groups, and also because of their group's large interest in the topic and their willingness to work with their farmers on the topic. We were able to have this very quick uptake so far, even despite all of the restrictions that Fiji faced because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so going forward, we're very excited to see how the products can be expanded to meet the needs of different interest groups going forward.
Okay, thank you. And maybe I have also a follow-up question for you. And as a moderator, of course, for me, it's also important to maybe take a critical stance sometimes. So, I mean, you mentioned in your introductory remarks that only maybe 5 to 10% of populations currently, vulnerable populations, only the most affluent people that can actually afford insurance products. And so definitely tackling the affordability challenge is a big ask. And we just heard that VAT exemption can contribute to that. But generally, what would you say in terms of making products more affordable, also to those that actually will, even with like certain activities and measures, will not be able to afford it in the near-term future. So can you maybe also explain some of the plans that are happening on this front? Yeah.
No, thank you, Sanka. This is a great point, and I believe Apana also mentioned this as something that we need to keep in mind, that when we develop different types of market-based insurance or other disaster risk finance and products, of course, it should always be understood how not every group in a country is going to be able to afford these products. And so what you want to do when working on a topic like this is to kind of have an understanding of the population of who's already protected, who needs protection and could potentially afford to purchase a market-based mechanism, and who are the groups that it just wouldn't be possible given their financing situation to purchase these types of products. And so in Fiji, what we've been doing is we've been in discussions with the World Food Programme to see how we can use the insurance product to link it together with some of the members of their social protection, social welfare recipients in from the government of Fiji. And so the World Food Programme does a lot of work with the government of Fiji to ensure that the lowest income groups have this access to additional financing and food security after extreme events. And what we want to look to do is see how insurance can then be used and given to recipients of social protection so that after an event occurs, they too can receive a bigger payout from insurance. And this we find is also a very key theme to making sure that people's situation does not get worse off. Governments do need to provide this extra support after different events, even though the governments themselves are in a much worse position financially. And this is why insurance can really play a key role, because the government or the party is purchasing this not after an event, but beforehand, then it means that the benefits of the product is going to come when people need it most. And so we very much look forward to working together with the government of Fiji and with the World Food Programme to offer this insurance to the lower income groups through different types of subsidized programming.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. And I believe this is also important actually from a climate justice perspective as well, that the frontline communities that are actually facing the biggest risk and can afford protection the least, that they also receive some support. And Lee, you just wanted to jump in on this one.
Yes, thank you. I think I really want to acknowledge Jennifer and the work that they're doing, and what she covered is absolutely correct. I just wanted to add, this is really based on a consultation that PICAP undertook in one of the communities in Fiji. So there's the issue of affordability. There's also the issue of understanding what the protection is and really understanding what the product is. So there is an element as well about financial literacy and understanding what insurance is. Because most people in the Pacific, when they talk about insurance, they think it's they don't need it, they don't understand it, and it's only for cars and vehicles, which is the most common insurance product out there. So there's one element. And the other element is the value proposition. So how do we actually get them to understand? And I've also, this is coming from consultation with the community, that once they realize, if you tell them it's going to cost you so much in premiums, they got to understand what the value proposition is, and that the benefit they get, and when we're talking about the protection gap, that the protection they get for that $1 a day or $1 a week or $1 a month, whatever the premiums might be, is actually worth it. And you'll find if you put it across that way, actually, in terms of the feedback that we got, they actually think that it's a good product, and they're willing to sacrifice some not so needed elements of expenses so that they can get a protection. And that's the value proposition that we have to put across. I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think that actually offers even more entry points for Jennifer to come in, but we also have like other contributions and presenters. So I'll come back to that point later on if time allows. So let me know, quickly go to you, Simone, and maybe also back to like public protection approach and also the national perspective. So adaptive social protection, as we heard about it and learned, is a multi-actor and multi-sector approach, multi-sector governance approach. And it brings together different communities of disaster, risk reduction, of social protection, of course, and also of climate change adaptation. Can you, I mean, we are at the Climate COP. Can you give us a little bit of insights what you think that especially the climate community and the climate adaptation sector can bring to social protection approaches?
Thanks a lot. That's a very interesting question. I guess it builds upon what has just been said. I think it adds to all our literacy, so to say, even as experts, coming from a science perspective as I do, but also I hope or I believe for government actors that we have to move from this, as earlier mentioned, from a reactionary attitude to a proactive one. And I think that is what the climate community can contribute here and is very, very much needed for. So on a conceptually side, I believe the climate community, what they can bring in with their perspective on climate hazards and their also background on forecasting and so on, it helps us, and their conceptual understanding of what risk and its components entail, it helps us moving from this reactionary perspective to also understanding the root causes of that risk that ASP is supposed to reduce then ultimately, so that we don't only fight the symptoms. What do I mean when saying that? I mean, of course it is very much needed to help people immediately after a disaster. But if we tackle the root causes, and if we build up a system which is really kicking in earlier, covering, let's say, the whole systemic risk, it does help us in lowering the overall risk. So in these terms, I think the climate community can support tremendously by this conceptual understanding. And on another note, I also believe that another factor which might not yet have been dealt with so much is that it can also help proofing whatever measure is in this social protection or adaptive social protection by taking an eye on the potential negative side effects of any measure. For instance, as one very little example, fishery communities or fishermen after a disaster, after a hurricane or so, one measure to support them in the past might have been fuel subsidies. But that might not be the best one in terms of climate mitigation. So here the climate community can also support proofing measures against their climate impacts, not only in the adaptation perspective, but also from a mitigation perspective.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe I want to, Apana, ask you. So we heard about different activities that are happening at the regional and the national level, but I also believe it's really important to actually empower the local level and the people on the local level. Do you have some insights also from the academy or from your work around how this can be done in the context of closing the protection gap?
Absolutely. It's an important question because I think ultimately, even when we're talking about climate finance more broadly, beyond just social protection, there's critiques around the climate finance not actually reaching local communities, right? And so obviously when you're looking at this from a social protection lens, that's a very significant gap. I think with regards to local level financing, with regards to social protection, from the academy, this was a theme that came out very strongly, and one that requires quite. I'm just pulling up the notes here to make sure that I can speak to the important research that was pulled together. But I think more broadly, I think we just have to ensure that any sort of adaptive social protection schemes that are designed, that they are actually informed by the communities, right? The last panelist that was just sharing with regards to the different mitigation and adaptation measures that can be taken, that's very context specific, right? What will be appropriate in one community may not be appropriate in another, right? And so I think especially when we're designing social protection schemes, they need to be really responsive and adaptive to the local context. And I think that's one that's really critical. But then I think also looking at, of course, financial constraints and considerations that Jennifer was referring to, whether it's requiring subsidized access through innovative partnerships with actors like the WFP or others, really ensuring that the social protection schemes are actually appropriate and accessible to the communities that are needing them, I think is really critical to ensure that it's actually providing local level access.
Okay, very nice. I think in terms of insurance solutions, empowering the local level is also increasing their literacy generally to be an appropriate counterpart to insurance companies when it comes to these products. Jennifer, maybe you want to comment on this perspective of financial literacy and what role it plays?
Yep, exactly. So thank you, Sunka. So yeah, I believe quite Lee and Apana have all spoken on this topic of the importance of financial literacy, and the situation you see sometimes with the development of different climate risk insurance products is that often enough emphasis and funding is provided to work on these certain topics. So if you have a product in the market and offer it to someone without having this component of financial literacy and sell it, they can easily become very disappointed if it's not working the way they expected, because during the sales point transaction it wasn't appropriately explained to them, right? Or as Lee explained, you could have the other situation where people just have absolutely no interest in the topic. especially with something like insurance, because it's only seen as something for cars or for the very rich parts of society, but not something that can benefit other groups as well. And so what we want to do through the Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program is we've been developing partnerships with different cooperatives and associations in Fiji, including the sugarcane, copra, rice, dairy farmers, Women's Business Council there to help build different financial literacy education training programs, so that what we can do is over time teach different concepts to groups about what is disaster risk financing, what are disaster risk financing strategies and how can they work to benefit you. And so what we do is we have participants of these trainings think about exactly how they've been affected by different risk in the past, how this has affected their livelihoods, what's the amount of money that they needed to recover, how much money did they lose, and which different mechanisms did they use then in order to help recover from these events. Often if you have a single event like a health scare, it's very easy to depend on families and friends for support, but when you have something like a tropical cyclone affecting an entire country, it's then very difficult to rely on your friends and neighbors for support because everybody's in a worse off situation. And so through these partnerships with different cooperatives, we then go through different training programs to first helping people to understand what their own financial situation is, how it is that they're affected by different risks, and what are the different options that they can take then to protect themselves. If they decide to take out insurance, how could this help them then in the recovery process? And if they decide to go down another route, how might this affect their financing if, for example, they decide to take out credit afterwards, or if they decide to depend solely on savings? What might happen in the case then if you have two events in a year, or especially as we've seen in the event of COVID-19, when you have these compounding risks that Lee was speaking about, it's very unpredictable what can happen. And so what you want to do is make sure people understand what the different possibilities are in terms of being able to reduce the risk. And then, of course, a strong educational component on exactly what's the difference between insurance, credit, and savings. How do interest rates and premium rates affect then the affordability of these products, and how will they affect the long-term benefits of these products depending on these different rates? And so thankfully, because of the work of UNCDF and UNDP, particularly in Fiji, working with these groups, we've been able to really spend a lot of time then with them, increasing their understanding so that they can make very well-based, educated decisions when it comes to purchasing different products.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I mean, you just mentioned also the role of being aware on how different climate risk affect your situation. And I think that actually speaks to a broader requirement. I think communities and societies need to be risk aware generally. So maybe Simone, you want to talk or speak to the topic of risk assessment when it comes to bringing together different protection approaches.
Yeah, gladly, and I'd of course love to do this in the context of adaptive social protection, where we are dealing with co-varied risk and also the compound effects to protect people not only from impacts of climate change, but also disasters or natural hazard-induced disasters exacerbated by climate change, but also support people by providing them social protection benefits, so which normally is being dealt with, normally is targeting the most poor and vulnerable. So we have different types of risk, and we have to bring this together in an assessment so that the people most in need are protected adequately. While this is already a challenge, this also covers different sectoral understandings. So the most and fundamental thing is to create a joint understanding, which sounds very easy and super obvious, but which in reality very often isn't, because there's different ministries doing their assessments with their indicators. So we have to establish kind of a coherent approach to really then develop targeting mechanisms which are good and appropriate. And that, of course, would need to be aligned and would need to bring together data and also data sharing mechanisms, which we, in the context of our ASP approach, in cooperation with GIZ and the government of Indonesia, have identified as one of the most crucial points here, seeing who's collecting which data and which type, and how to bring it then together in a very kind of not basic, but in an approach which is then rooted in the IPCC understanding of risk, being compiled of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And then those factors not necessarily are understood in the same way in those sectors. So this has been a very interesting, although also challenging approach, but in the end this resulted in really some hints at where to allocate also which resources, which regions and areas might be most at risk, which would need ASP approaches, which then obviously would need to be locally suitable, because I just want to relate back to what Aparna and I think also earlier on Lee said, solutions and approaches need to be context specific. If people don't understand how an insurance works and what it brings as a benefit, people might not want to take it up. The same is true for any other type of approach. So it's about the assessment, understanding how this functions, and then developing the adequate mechanisms.
Okay, sweet. And maybe before I come to the conclusion of the sessions, one last question to you, Lee, if I may put you on the spot again. I mean, we heard about different approaches at different levels, and my understanding is also that you are actually a conduit or an umbrella for like kind of streamlining and coordinating action across the region. So what is your vision around different actors coming into the space of closing the protection gap? How do you see this fitting together? And what would also be your ask towards these actors? Big question, sorry for that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and really, given that we're running out of time, I want to answer that by making reference to something that Simone said right at the start around social protection, and also something you said in your introduction around loss and damage. So to bring that together, so in the Pacific, we made tremendous advances in bridging this climate risk protection gap with the layering of risks. Again, what Simone just spoke about. So layering of risk, understanding the interventions and modalities. In the Pacific, we have the Framework for Resilience Development, or the FRDP, which takes a multi-pronged, multi-sectorial, multi-disciplined approach to resilient development. So with this, we looked at, if we talk about multi-sectors, what are the different sectors that have fit into risk protection? What are the different disciplines? Technology is one, innovations, traditional knowledge is quite important for us as well. All these factors were to bring them together. So as a conduit through a regional organization, I think this is something we do quite well. So it involves community consultations. You have to bring the people there. And let me say something about community consultations. Usually community consultations are done in preparation for projects. But what happens when the projects are implemented? Sometimes the community consultants or the members that were part of consultations are left out of the equation. So it should be community consultations for the community, not for the project. The project is just a conduit through which the community benefits. So if I can just expand the discussion to the specific context, we just spoke about solutions should be context relevant and fit for purpose. I just want to touch on the issues of loss and damage. So while we're talking about protection for a risk, which is a specific event or potential events, there are these issues, underlying issues, and I think something we should be forward-looking towards is how do you actually have an insurance policy for the slow ones, for loss of culture, for loss of livelihoods, for loss of homes, and in the worst case scenario, in the case of Tuvalu, I can speak for, which I'm a Tuvalu national, the loss of sovereignties. You know, when we come to, we at COP, we come to COP, we talk about finances, and we're asking for finances. It's not about finances. Finances is just a way of compensating, if you like, or paying for the liability or the potential liability of the risk that's is caused by climate change. We all know this, like I said right at the start, the science is there. How do we then ensure that we make use of this data, and that we also set in place protection measures? And how do we actually look forward, not just the protection measures and the risks that we know that we have the data on, but we also have the potential risks. So, and I think these are important discussions to have. And as a regional organization, and these are the kind of discussions we want to bring to the table and bring the partners together. And I'm confident, I'm happy to say that some of the partners we spoke to realize this. Now it's just finding a means of how do we do it? How do we deliver on this? And this is where the dialogue needs to keep going. And I'll finish with that now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also asking the other panelists maybe to have like some concluding thoughts. Jennifer, I'll start with you based on the discussions that happened and what you just heard.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with Lee's points. The fact of the matter is topics like disaster risk financing and climate only go so far. And the fact is many of the regions like we're working in, for example, the Pacific, there's so many other aspects that are at stake, right? And these conversations, fortunately, at COP, luckily have a place for them to take place and to hear from others and to gather on these certain topics. But certainly, I think a lot more needs to be done in terms of figuring out how we're going to address this and how we're going to take this recognition of what we're losing because of the effects of climate change, how we can deal with the situation going forward. And so, well, certainly you do see this recognition from some countries and wanting to help support different projects and endeavors. Certainly, I think we need to take this dialogue further. And I look forward to seeing then how in the upcoming months we're going to be able in the upcoming years find new ways of addressing these different types of risks that exist.
Okay, thanks. And Simone, do you have anything to add?
Thanks a lot. I also want to continue on the thoughts that were just raised by Lee and then Jennifer. I think, or I'm convinced this is not only about surviving. So we're not talking about any of those mechanisms just to support people surviving. I guess Lee just made that point, and it resonates so much with me. Also, in the context of adaptive social protection, this is not only about supporting people in the aftermath of a disaster by providing food or something which is definitely needed, but we have to talk about their livelihoods and support them in living a good life. And so any type of mechanism that we're developing, and that is super urgent to be developed in whatever country. I don't want to touch upon the floods we had in Germany earlier this year, but which also have shown that we need to do something across this globe in any country. But this is definitely about supporting people not only after, but also before whatever disaster and future disasters exacerbated by climate change kick in. It's about really supporting them in still living a good life with all the mechanisms and support that we can contribute to. And here, I think we all need to join forces.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. And Aparna?
Thank you. Yeah, I think, just stepping back a bit, really kind of emphasizing that social protection really is a matter of justice. And so I think when we're talking about climate finance more broadly and gaps in flows, gaps in the local level financing and how it's trickling down or not, rather, I think really looking at it from the perspective of climate justice, I think is really essential to inform some of the conversations on how we're actually allocating financing, designing these programs, and ensuring access.
Okay, thank you. I mean, also thank to all the speakers and the online community for following us and for giving us your concluding remarks. One announcement I want to do is that colleagues informed me that the Summer Academy actually is going to launch a policy brief on some of the insights that you heard today. And so definitely stay tuned. We will publish it on the website of United Nations University, but also I think Munich Re Foundation is going to put this online. So that's an announcement I wanted to do. And yeah, thank you to the panelists to also putting the perspectives back to what is at discussion here at COP. And Aparna, thank you also for making the justice argument last. Actually, this is what I want to do now after this event. There's a big demonstration outside, so I will join that, making the climate justice point. So thanks very much, and see you soon on the different channels, and different perspectives.